I wasn't planning on doing a video on this project, but I ran into something that I'm pretty sure isn't covered out there, so I wanted to cover it very quickly. So I'm doing a rebuild on a TKO 600 transmission, and is already information out there. However, none of them are actually working on a TKO 600, and so I ran into something that's specific to that. Now, one of the more common issues with this line of transmissions is leakage, and the most common location of that leakage is from this front bearing retainer on the cluster gear. Now, in order to repair that, we'll need to remove the cluster gear. And in any information you may find, it'll simply say to slide the cluster gear out back this way, slide this gear through, and then pop it out once you remove this bearing on this side. However, that's not possible on the TKO 600 because this gear is larger. It has a 287 first gear, so this gear is larger. So this gear doesn't actually fit through this hole. So what's different about the TKO 600 is that this bearing retainer is not flanged. And instead of being installed from the inside out or from the rear forward, it's actually installed from the front rearward with no flange. And the only way to get this cluster gear out is to push it back toward the front. Now, you can do that easily enough by using a brass hammer and gently tapping on this shaft. However, the real struggle comes into the fact that this gear will run into the case before you're able to actually get enough clearance to get it out. At which point, I recommend using something like this. I used some 1/4-inch bar stock of mild steel. You can slip it down between the gear and the bearing cup, because the bearing cup will continue to be out further than the wall of the case, and continue while holding it in there. Continue to tap on the end of the shaft here until this bearing releases, till the cup releases. Once this is out far enough, which is almost until it falls out, then you'll be able to just barely slide this by and remove the cluster gear. Now that I've got the bearing retainer completely removed, I just want to talk through this leak a little bit more. Because this retainer isn't flanged, in order to set preload or end play on that cluster gear, you can't just push it against the interior wall. So something else has to hold this in place. You'll notice there's a lot of witness marks on the outside of this bearing retainer. The only thing holding it in place is where the front main shaft, the input shaft retainer, comes across, and there on the bell housing. The bell housing isn't completely flat. It actually has ridges, and if you look, you'll see where it appears to be scuffed up here. That's where it comes in contact with the bell housing. So all in all, it's being held in only at those locations where you see scuffing, which means it's only really being held in on one side. And that can produce a situation where it may want to become cocked. So this is why you'll want to reinstall this with sealant, some sort of flexible sealant, so that if it becomes slightly cocked due to this uneven retaining method, it'll still hold the seal. With the TKO 600, reinstalling the cluster gear is going to be a little bit more of a multi-step process. So I've already installed it from the outside in. You'll notice that I've reoriented it the same way it came out, such that these witness marks from the bell housing line up. I don't know if you can see in the video, but this is actually indented, like it's actually applying substantial pressure on here. And when the transmission is in this state of assembly, the only thing holding this in is the main bearing, the front input bearing retainer. So hammer in from this side with a brass hammer, but then you'll probably find that you'll have to go in too far in order to make sure that it fully seats, and then install this bearing retainer and then check for clearance here. You'll probably find clearance, at which point you'll want to tap back on the shaft until you can't get a feeler gauge behind here. Then you'll know that this bearing cup retainer is where it will land under final assembly, so that you can set your bearing preload on the cluster shaft. Now, the next step, what I'm going to do is actually install the bell housing so that this part, because it actually can get cocked a little bit because it's only being retained on the one side. So I'm going to actually install the bell housing temporarily. Before I install the bell housing temporarily, I actually just wanted to show you how much of an impact this flangeless bearing cup has. You can actually see the witness mark from the bearing cup on the bell housing. the bearing cup actually went compressed into the aluminum bell housing, it looks like, I mean, it feels like at least 0.003 of an inch. The actual specification for the TKO and 3550 series transmissions is 0 preload to 0.004 end play. But for a high performance application where the transmission gets very hot, you'll want a little bit of preload because the transmission case is aluminum and it'll expand more than under street applications. So in order to retain proper end play under very hot conditions, you actually want a little bit of preload. All right, I have the transmission case mocked up to the bell housing, and I wanted to show you the shimming procedure. I want to clarify that I'm using all the same bearings, shafts, and parts, cases, everything. The only reason I'm turning this down is for synchro work and to address the leak. So the bearings are the same, the shaft is the same, everything's the same. So there's no reason that the preload should change on reassembly from where it was at before. I start with thickest shims that I think might do the trick and work my way down. The reason for that is because this cup doesn't have a flange on it, or even if it does, we want to make sure it's fully seated when we're setting our preload, because during operation in service, it will definitely fully seat at that point once you start loading up the transmission. So we don't want to get inaccurate results. As you're torquing the bolts down, keep checking that you can turn the cluster gear by hand. If at any point you cannot turn the cluster gear by hand, you have too many shims, take the tail housing off and take at least 0.005 out and do it again. Once you get to the point you can start turning it by hand, then you'll feel the drag and you'll know you have preload. And you keep shaking out the shims until you'll notice the preload or the friction goes away on this shaft. And then if you go just a little bit further, you'll notice a little bit of end play. I started out at 0.030 shim, which is what came out of the transmission. And I worked my way all the way down to 0.21 before I noticed that it felt like the friction had gone away. And at 0.19 is where I'm at now. I can feel just the tiniest bit of slop, which means that zero end play for this transmission is 0.20. This is important because this transmission came with 0.30. And as you saw earlier in the video, you saw very strong witness marks from where the bearing cup is pressing up against the bell housing. Well, this suddenly makes sense. This transmission was assembled at the factory with 0.30 shims, and this bell housing was not in place at that time, and the way it's retained, the bearing cup was likely crooked. It was pushing out onto the bearing cup. Then, once the transmission was installed on the bell housing, it was forcing it back in, and then you have 0.10 of preload, which is a lot of axial load, and you get a lot of wear and tear on everything. So at this point, we're at 0.19. I'll add another 3 to 0.004 to establish the preload, and then I know I'm set to continue with reassembly of the transmission.